All right. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. On the discussion, hosted by myself and JeRod Lindsey, we are happy to have Jeniece Jones, Executive Director of Housing Opportunities Made Equal of Greater Cincinnati. Jeniece, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. If you can tell us a little bit about your background and what HOME does.
Okay, well, I'm Jeniece Jones. I'm Executive Director at Housing Opportunities Made Equal. I've been at HOME for about 5 years now. Before that, I worked for a local nonprofit called Community Shares of Greater Cincinnati. I was the Executive Director there. Before that, I was in real estate practice as an Ohio attorney. And then before that, I think I was in law school. So we're back into the early to mid 90s now. So I came to HOME about 5 years ago. I was really excited to learn that the position was available, and so I asked around and did some research and really put myself out there as a potential candidate because I really saw the work that the agency had been doing and really wanted to be a part of that team in terms of really doing civil rights work. So it was a nice marriage for me in terms of looking at my legal background, but then also doing the ground level, grassroots level work around fair and affordable housing for our entire community. So HOME is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are 52 years old this year. So the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. Shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King. So that was one of the impetus to finally get the act passed. And then shortly thereafter, HOME became its own agency. We hung out our shingle. We put the word out that if you're experiencing illegal discrimination in housing, please come to HOME. Some of the things that we do is around the idea of protected classes. So protected classes are areas of historical patterns of discrimination that were recognized and codified, if you will, in the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So this can be race, sex or gender, religion, national origin, familial status, and disability are all areas that if there's discrimination or differential treatment based on any of these, protected class statuses, HOME can step in and do several things. So the key thing that we do is enforcement. And to do enforcement, that means we have to launch investigations into complaints of illegal discrimination. So despite what some people might think, someone who calls us or comes to our office and says, I've been discriminated because my children are now living with me, or I'm being discriminated against because I'm Black, or I'm being discriminated against because I have a heavy Hispanic accent. HOME will launch investigations to verify that if we can, or corroborate the story of the person making the complaint. And then we work with them on remedies, on action they can take to get back some of what they lost because they experienced this discrimination. So we have a testing program where we do some secret shopping. So everybody knows what a secret shopper is. Well, we do that in the real estate market here in Cincinnati too. So we send out testers to see if illegal discrimination is happening. Sometimes they're based on complaints, but other times we just may decide to test parts of the market just to see what's going on out there. And we use that information to determine if there's, we didn't detect any discrimination, or it was inconclusive, or we did detect discrimination. So now we have to do additional work to try to get that rectified and remedied. We also have landlord-tenant support. So these are questions where there may not be, the Fair Housing Act may not be implicated in the dispute or the issue between landlords and tenants or neighbors, or people who live across the street from each other, or something of that nature. We can help folks remedy that as well. through some work with mediation, bringing folks around the table, communicating. So hopefully that whatever that issue is, it can be resolved before additional steps are taken, because we know ultimately in a tenant situation, landlord-tenant situation, eviction is always out there as something could occur if things aren't resolved. And then we do tons of education. So if you go to Home's website, homecincy.org, you'll go to click through to on the COVID tab, and you'll see our podcast series around COVID-19 and how it's impacting various different areas of housing. So we'll have another one of those out Monday to the community, to talk about what we're seeing. And so this was something we started in early March, and we've just been, as new issues come up and bubble up, we've been doing the work of trying to get the word out around, this is what's happening, educating the community. So we do about 100 or so education sessions a year. We do about 3,000 or so intakes of folks who call us and tell us they're experiencing some type of unfairness in their housing. And we do that with a very small staff and a very small budget comparatively. But we're definitely focused on, illegal discrimination, promoting stable, integrated communities, and, bringing communities together.
So I'm sorry. One of the things that I'm interested in, Jeniece, is you talked about how people will come to Home and say, hey, I'm being discriminated against because I have an accent or because I'm a minority or I have kids. How can you all verify that? Like, what does that process look like for you all to verify that?
Well, we do have something called testing methodology that we use.
Right.
So some of it is secret, just like our testers are secret. So if some of our testers, for example, if there's maybe some testers that work for Home that are on this call, right now, but they can't identify themselves.
Right.
So we can't publicly recognize them because, the key around testing is secrecy. But a very common method of testing is to do something called a matched pair test. And that's where you take the protected class and a non-protected class individual or family, and you have them go into the housing situation with similar facts, around income, when they can move in, how many people are in the household, those types of information, except one may be Black, one may be white, one may be Hispanic, one may be white, one may be a family with adults, one may be a family with children. So we use that methodology to gather information about whether or not those two groups, when they went into that housing situation, were treated differently.
Okay.
And so we build out some additional information from there. So we get the results of that investigation, then we go from there to see what our next steps might be.
Now, is everyone protected under FHA? And when I say everyone, I mean, if a person buys their own property, so let's say it's just an individual owner who wants to rent out their property opposed to a company, are they still expected to listen to the FHA Act, or is that correct?
Absolutely. So there are no, so whether you're an individual, for sale by owner situation, or you're a company, or you're a real estate firm or a realtor, a property with a management company that's managing 5 properties or 500, the Fair Housing Act applies, whether it's public housing or private housing. So there's sometimes a misconception that if it's not, public housing is the only time that the Fair Housing Act applies, that private individuals have the right to do what they want with their property. And that's not the case. It still applies equally across the board. In fact, public property has a few more bells and whistles in terms of how that property is funded, what are some regulations attached to that being a public property or public asset property, that also comes into play with what we do.
Okay, awesome. So we have a pandemic on our hands, right?
Yes, we do.
Prior to getting on live, we were talking, you, Maurice, and I, we're talking about just how you and home is dealing with that. Can you share a little bit about how you all have switched to a virtual workspace, what education looks like to people now, and then afterwards just kind of get into what the pandemic is going to bring forth as far as evictions and things of that nature?
Okay. So one of the key things that was a concern to us in late February, early March was that, we have had a walk-in program. So during our business hours, anybody could walk in off the street with their files, their folders, their paperwork, and sit down with a fair housing or housing counselor and talk about what was going on. So what we started learning was that so many folks were at risk, and, whether it be one of us getting ill and passing the virus on, or someone, coming into our office and, passing the virus on. So we decided early on, like, okay, what do we need to do to take this to steer this one, steer this ship virtual. And
so was this, I'm sorry to interrupt. Was this in February? Was this prior to everything shutting down on March 13th or 12th or 13th?
Yep.
Okay.
Because we, I had seen some things, and one of the unique things about fair housing centers is that there's several hundred around the country. So I was seeing things in other parts of the country around, the spread of this, and then, that it had hit Europe and it hit this part of the country, and there were some very, scary things on the Reddit. So being very paranoid, I just started saying, well, okay, well, if we had to work remotely, could we? And what does that look like? And where do we need to get ourselves up to speed on technology to make that happen? So we started exploring different ways of, making sure everyone had the appropriate tools and equipments at their house to do a remote, session, making sure our phones could be forwarded to our cell phones, setting up a schedule for us to take calls, communicating with Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as the Ohio Civil Rights Commission about cases we'd already filed. So we had several dozen cases that were in process, either on behalf of our clients or on behalf of home, that were somewhere in the administrative enforcement process that we had to say, okay, what's going to happen with this hearing? What's going to happen with this? So we started working it out. We devised a pandemic disaster plan, and I think I circulated that around March 9th or 11th, around there. And then we did a dry run, and then we decided that, it was just best that we, I think we put ourselves out till April 1st originally. Again, I think that was a bit wishful thinking, and then we just have been carrying on all the way. We're also continuing with our education. Some are new opportunities to educate the community, like this one, but others were things we already had scheduled, and we were like, what do you want to do? And again, other folks were still like, well, can you do something virtually? Can you do something on Teams or Zoom? And so we started working on how that needed to look as well. So we just really didn't want there to be any gap in services. And so we worked tirelessly to make sure that didn't happen. And I think we've been successful. We miss being in our office. We understand that our office space, as well as the building that we share with the United Way, is going to go through a deep clean this month. And then we'll assess from there whether or not we'll be back in the office. But we did have a special thought in terms of our most vulnerable populations and folks coming to the office and just keeping everybody safe.
So what is it looking like as far as you approaching or helping people in regards to evictions with the pandemic? Or are you seeing anything that you feel like will be, or what are you seeing that will be impactful on behalf of the pandemic?
Well, one of the things we know is that in Hamilton County, at least we know for sure, without question, hit the pause button on evictions in mid-March.
Okay.
So that means all the evictions that had been scheduled had stopped. Anything that had come up between then and now haven't had a court date.
Okay.
So that, on top of the fact that we are concerned about folks not being able to make their rent.
Yeah.
And so we think there's been a lot of, you know, I would say leniency with property management in terms of everybody knows that there's a pandemic. So
Right.
it's not an individualized situation of someone calling and saying, you know, my car broke down or they cut my hours at work. You know, everybody has the same situation. So we feel like, you know, the workout rate between landlords and tenants right now is working well. But at some point, there becomes the question of when stimulus dollars, you know, are gone, when folks find out, you know, some folks are going to go back to work, but some folks aren't.
Right.
Then where will we be? And so that is our concern in terms of getting the word out to individuals about some things that are available in the community in terms of assistance around rent. So there's a couple of agencies within the city of Cincinnati that have rent assistance for those. So it's Legal Aid Society of Southwestern Ohio.
Okay.
You mind putting the link in the chat box? Or maybe I can find it. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Legal Aid Society. If they type in Legal Aid Society, Cincinnati, Southwest Ohio, it'll come up. The Community Action Agency in Bond Hill, everybody knows pretty much where that is. They have some funds, and as well as St. Vincent de Paul.
Yes.
Also have funds for those who qualify. Job and Family Services also qualified, or they did. You know, so the funds are limited, but and hopefully they're replenishing. But you know, again, those are areas, those are folks who have the apparatus, the infrastructure in place to do some rent assistance right now.
What does it look like to qualify?
That's up to that agency. So they do the calculation to determine if folks qualify. But my sense is that again, there'll be some change about what that means under these circumstances. Another thing, you know, I would just encourage folks to do at the utmost is to communicate with their landlord, their property managers. So if you don't take away anything I say today, you know, that's key, is to communicate your situation with your property management. If you feel like you're going to be late or you're running behind on the rent, and preferably do that in writing. So even if it's a matter, so I know everybody can't come to your kitchen table right now necessarily and you know, work out a document, but even to the extent of if you're text messaging, you know, back and forth, keep those text messages, print those out. If you're talking to someone, you're having a conversation with someone, and this can also be in the mortgage lending space as well. If you're talking to your mortgage servicer, you know, get their name, write down the date and the time, see if you get an email address for whoever you're speaking with, and then follow that conversation up with a email or a text that says, you know, thanks for speaking with me today about my housing situation and being late on my rent. As I told you, COVID-19 has cut my job hours by 60%. You know, and we're working to make rent payments now. Well, we would like to take the next several months to make rent payments. So add an additional amount over or whatever it is, but be that specific and have that writing in place, because should we come to the state, if it proceeds to the point of eviction, you know, we at least want to have that clear communication between the tenant to the landlord about the circumstances, and that may carry some weight in a court proceeding.
Certainly.
And so you and your team can actually help or be better suited to help someone if it comes to eviction, if these documents are already in tow, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So, yes. So we have sample documents we can send out to folks as well. So if folks call and say, I heard you say something, what? You know, we have documents that we can say, okay, here's a template of what you should include in your communication. And we can send that out to anyone who asks for it. But the communication is key. And, you know, we found also talking to some of the larger property management associations that they appreciate that as well. They're very open to those conversations, you know, but they need to know what's going on.
All right. And JeRod, before I go, I got a question from my good friend Ashley. She said, what advice would you give to those who are facing an eviction after the court reopens? Many may be in a more critical place now than they were prior to the pandemic.
Well, first things first, I would definitely see if you're eligible for some type of rent assistance to one of those agencies that I just mentioned. First things first. You know, and then I would also communicate with your property management, get something in writing to them, an email, you know, per our, you know, our conversation this morning, we discussed this and that, you know, is my understanding correct? Yes, no, you know, get that in writing, that could be helpful, but that is key. And there's also an opportunity for those who are, you know, more civic minded or comfortable with calling Congress, calling your state senators, calling your United States senators in Ohio and telling them that it's a good idea to pass, and I have it by name here, so the Emergency Rental Assistance Rental Market Stabilization Act. Sherrod Brown introduced that last week. He's a senator in Ohio, and that is more funds through this COVID bills that have come out over the last couple of months. But these are, this bill has funds directed directly at rent relief. And so I would say contact your congressperson as well as your state senator. And I think you can go on senate.gov or house.gov and, you know, see who your state senators are if there are folks on the call that outside of Ohio.
Hey, so can you repeat that that bill once more for us?
Yes, it's the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act.
All right, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Jeniece. Did you have any follow up on that, Mo?
No, I that's great. No, great.
So,
thank you for sharing that. I think that's very important. I think
it's one of those things that just came out like this week. So that's why I said I've got, you know, paper and post-it notes everywhere because, you know, this is fast and furious, but, you know, this is something that's a real bright, solid action that Congress can take to help everyone. So I think the bill has $100 billion towards rental assistance in the U.S. So, you know, it's definitely, if, like I said, folks who are comfortable with that, making those calls and doing that outreach to their representation.
Certainly. And in our previous last week we had Kevin Finn from Strategies to End Homelessness. He kind of mentioned that same thing, and I believe Jenny Berg as well mentioned that. So thank you. It's a common thing, you know. Reach out to your representatives.
Right, because this is
what they're there
bigger
for.
than our agencies. You know, our
right.
COVID. You know, the first thing we realized right away is this. You know, our even really, really big agencies and really, really small agencies are kind of in the same boat around our thinking is like, you know, this is huge. And, you know, this type of, you know, 100-year pandemic, I guess, is not something that many of us living,
right.
you know, have never experienced before. So, you know, again, it definitely has to go through, you know, in my opinion, you know, to our, you know, your national representation. I mean, this is why we elect these folks is to help us when we have, you know, issues like this.
And this is obviously going to have a lasting impact. I want to get into something that really interests me. You and I talked briefly about it Jeniece, is the racial disparity in living quarters, right, in Cincinnati. With you being in home, and I'm sure you've heard of some egregious cases, maybe not, in regards to housing discrimination. I was just wondering if you could share from your expertise any discriminatory cases that you've heard, being as explicit or limited as you would like. And also, just why do you get that vibe that Cincinnati is like that? And do you see it shifting with all the, I guess, the development that has been going on in Cincinnati over the last few years?
Great question.
Yeah, that's a very important question, in terms of, disparities in communities,
right,
comes to development and displacement and folks being priced out. That's something that we've been harping upon and chiming in on for years. One of the things I think folks can do is, again, and this is more of a shift to your local policymakers, is, ask your local policymakers when they're running for city council, when they're running for Hamilton County Commissioner, what is their policy for fair and affordable housing? What is their, please explain, what you would do to ensure that there's fair, affordable housing. Please explain what you would do to ensure that developers who get, in some cases, sweetheart deals, have an obligation to also create a fair and affordable housing when they're also creating luxury housing. They can build luxury housing. They can also build fair and affordable housing.
Agreed. Yes.
And before they get sweetheart deals, tax abatements, and all the things, there needs to be some strings attached that they also create affordable housing in communities that need more affordability for one. I think that's one of the key things that we've seen consistently. So that inability to pay rent that we get, before all this, now this is kind of a different situation, but before all this, we didn't just come into home, mid-March and say, oh my goodness, there's going to be all these evictions. What's an eviction? Let's look that up and see if we can figure out how to address that, because we've never had, we were getting folks calling us regularly for years, with issues around affordability. And affordability in connection to conditions. So housing conditions and affordability are two key things that are sometimes related. And those were the complaints we were getting from tenants before all this happened. So it was a problem identified. I think the Community Building Institute did a study a couple of years ago. Home worked with the Cincinnati Project and University of Cincinnati and Legal Aid on a study that came out in 2018 around evictions. It's called "You've Been Asked to Leave the Premises" eviction study. I think if you Google that, it'll come up in a couple of different places. Well, we have shared openly with policymakers in the community this need to address housing affordability. So in an election year, now's the best time is to read at least the executive summary on some of this, and when you're to community meetings and town halls and those types of, community-based engagement with, folks running for office, ask them what their plan is. And say, my vote is closely tied to keeping my housing affordable.
How are housing conditions and affordability related? How are they intertwined?
Well, typically, so if, housing that's very inexpensive tends to sometimes have issues with conditions. So that just means that the investor, the real estate investor, hasn't put the dollars into that housing that they could have, should have, to keep the house habitable.
Definitely should have, right?
Yeah, so we get calls like that too. So sometimes these are families who were just, desperate for housing. They had to take the first thing available because they needed housing so bad. This might be someone who's had evictions in their past. So it makes them exceptionally difficult for them to find decent housing going forward. That's something that our study found. a couple years ago. So, you know, those two things kind of go hand in hand.
So you all would be willing, does home assist with those people as well if they are? Okay, so I think that's important for me to understand, and I think for the public to understand as well, that home doesn't just assist with blatant discriminatory acts, but also if someone isn't keeping their upkeep on the property that you're renting, home, regardless of how much rent you're paying, home will be able to assist you. Come in, what do you all do? Take pictures and say, okay, this isn't it.
Yeah, typically they send us the pictures.
Okay, all right.
Yeah,
They're not wasting any time.
They do it themselves, right?
They send us the pictures when they call because they want us to call them right back if they get a voicemail. You know, they're like, "Did you see this?" Yeah, we talk about, you know, what they're, you know, what's going on with the conditions. We may call the landlord and say, you know, what's going on. You know, what's the plan to get the work orders on this particular unit addressed. You know, the city and the county also, you know, have health departments that can go in and do an inspection. The city can cite property managers and landlords who don't keep their properties up to code. So we help tenants, you know, navigate that if we have to. And then sometimes if it's so bad, you know, we will also contact our partners at Legal Aid and say, you know, hey, you know, will you take a look at this? You know, this one's particularly bad. You know, what can you do to help? You know, and go from there. But we definitely get condition calls pretty regularly too.
Okay. Did you have something more?
Yes. So last week, Kevin, you know, our discussion last week was around homelessness, and Kevin mentioned something that was very it really shocked me, right? You know, and not knowing or kind of figuring out like the myths. You know, there's a lot of myths about homelessness and things. And one of the things that I suspected was, once this hit, you know, there's people being homeless every day. And it's like, no, it doesn't quite happen like that. And he also mentioned how, you know, if prevention, if you put dollars into prevention, for instance, if you gave somebody assistance with helping pay rent, like some of the great organizations that you listed that do, St. Vincent de Paul, Legal Aid Society, Cincinnati Community Action Agency. So Kevin brought up those things, and one of the things is now with this COVID-19, homelessness. I mean, is that a concern of yours? And if so, well, evictions, right? Once the docket kind of opens up, you're going to see this flood of things. Last I checked, you know, there are 33 million people who filed for unemployment in the United States. And I know in our county we have they're getting, you know, hundreds of calls a day for unemployment. What's going to be the long-term effects of this? What like, if you can kind of just in your, again, we haven't been here before. This is something different, right?
Well, that's a concern. And, you know, Kevin's assessment was probably right, is that, you know, we will see, firstly, probably folks who start to double up. You know, start to live with a friend or a cousin, or, you know, and do the couch surfing thing. But that only goes so far. I mean, anybody that's ever been in that situation, you know, man, look. anyone that can relate to what that's like, somehow can say, you know, I only have so much time to get myself together, to get the security deposit saved, and, you know, all the things, to find a place and this and that. If you have children, that's another concern. If you're disabled, that's another concern. Right. You know, in terms of, so you know, at the end of the day, you know, and I go back to this rent relief bill that's making its way through Congress now. At the end of the day, that's where we end up. Yeah. And so once folks once folks have exhausted that last third cousin, you know, that they can stay with, you know, the next thing is shelter. And if the shelter's full, the next thing is the street. So it's very real, and it can happen exceptionally fast in ordinary circumstances. So anything that comes down the pike to address this issue in terms of dollars and cents to keep people in their housing is key, because the longer term effects are astronomical. I mean, you can't even, I don't think you can put a dollar amount on it. I think the human cost so high that it's one of those spiritual questions.
Right.
How do you even put a cost on something that could be so devastating to human beings? So it's one of those things that I'd hesitate to put a number to, but there are things that we can do to keep us from getting there. And I think pushing Congress to pass legislation to support rent relief is key. Right.
This is I'm coming for some personal opinion right now, right? Why do you think, let me ask you this. Do you think people, right, minorities or whomever, push Congress the way that they should? If not, why not?
Love the question, JeRod. Love the question.
Well, I think there's a lot that folks, so some of this may be stuff people never had to address before.
Okay.
We've never been here before. I think, the power of collective action is key. That's how we got the Fair Housing Act. That's how we got Civil Rights Act. That's how we repealed Jim Crow. That's how we got rid of slavery. So if you go, it was the power of collective action. And so as a civil rights organization, HOME, at its core, we see the importance of thinking aspirationally around what's possible if we act collectively to achieve our goals, because we wouldn't be here if it wasn't possible.
Exactly.
Right.
And so, in a lot of ways, a lot of our communities, our ancestors, are folks that experienced the discrimination that relayed in the Fair Housing Act, survived horrific challenges, and thought and dreamed of a better future.
Right.
So it's in our DNA. It's in our marrow. And so we just have to reactivate that core to move ourselves forward.
I agree with you so much. And I speak with many of my peers these days, and many of them may not realize how impactful the civil rights movement was, and how the collective action. When we hear police brutality and things like that, you kind of see that come together. It's like, hey, we have the power, And this is kind of one of those issues that I think we need to continue to provide education around, as HOME does, which is amazing, and let people understand. Hey, let's reach out to our representatives. Let's get this happening. The eviction rates in Hamilton County and around other metropolitan areas are just so high, and it's really very unfortunate. Very unfortunate. And there hasn't been a person that has been growing up and been evicted from a place before. I understand how that feels, and it's not a good feeling, especially when you have children trying to go to school, trying to learn.
And
you talk about adverse childhood experiences. Yeah. I mean, that affects everything,
And there's a lot of data that supports that as well. That is something that kids don't just get over. Families experience.
Still not over it.
Yeah, still mad about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, but that's absolutely something that if we can avoid that type of adverse experience, we should, because it's like I said, it's hard to then start quantifying the cost not only to the individual but society as a whole as people experience these things without recourse.
Exactly. 100%. I want to go back to something we touched on a little bit earlier about tax abatements and luxury spending for houses, right? What would you say to someone who says, all right, it's not economically responsible for us to continue to build affordable housing, right? These are conversations that I've been privy to. When you get Section 8, they tear your house up. They don't care about your property. All of those things, which I think is discrimination. That's just my personal opinion, discrimination in its own right. But what do you say to those people who say, it's just better for the economy if we don't have affordable housing. And if we do have affordable housing, let's just push it out there or push it in a designated area where it's not, where they don't have as many opportunities or access to different things, right? So they're very selective about where they put the affordable housing at.
Yeah. So yeah, and I've heard those conversations too. And some people have said things publicly, or I've gone to a session or a panel and then someone says, pulls me aside and says, but we can't have affordable housing here or this,
Right.
And my thing is like, look, anybody that has mortgages and a mortgage interest right up on their taxes has subsidized housing. That's a subsidy that everybody has access to. If you have a mortgage that's on a $250,000 mortgage, that's on a $750,000, that's on a $2 million mortgage. You'll have that write-off. So if we can put tax dollars into subsidizing that type of housing, then we should put tax dollars into housing that supports, workforces and families. I think that's been my, or nobody should get it.
Right, right.
So, so that's been my thinking around that. And then affordability is attractive to businesses and economic development. I mean, sure, some businesses come and they think about their C-suite and they think about their VP suite of officers working for the company. And yes, we want to have nice, places to attract those folks to come. But then there's also, folks working in the mailroom and in the cafeteria and all the different, all the, workers who need housing as well. And if that business is going to run efficiently and effectively, and successfully in our area, then that business has to be able to see top to bottom that their employees are going to be able to afford housing.
Do you think
very clear business model in terms of to be able to bring those mid-level and upper level positions to a community? Well, you've got to have organizational wide, housing affordability for all the employees.
So let me ask you this, because I noticed that you rub shoulders with people in the C-suites who may be the executives of companies, right? And also you're rubbing shoulders with people who need affordable housing, right? So you're rubbing shoulders with the lender and you're rubbing.
We lost JeRod.
Okay, hopefully he comes back. And I'll let him ask this question. I think I know where he was going, but I'm not sure. But so I noticed, in Avondale, we had the Avondale Town Center, redone. And one of the things I noticed is that none of the storefronts are hardly being utilized. And I don't know if you could speak to that a little bit, but my question was, we're talking about affordability. My assumption is that that's the reason why those storefronts aren't taking. And the other thing is, do people want storefronts?
Yeah.
And I don't know if you know a lot about the Avondale Town Center in particular.
I know some. I've heard some of what's going on, but again, that's the question for community councils.
Yeah.
So, again, that's something that you would address, before, when, you see storefronts or when you see, cement trucks show up, or when you see somebody show up in suits, walking and looking around and pointing at things, to address that to your community councils and ask, what's the plan for this property? What's the plan for this space? How is it being inclusive?
Right.
What's the model for inclusivity for this new development?
Right.
And so that would be an interesting question, I think, to get an answer to. The
community councils is
yes.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Go ahead, JeRod. With your question, buddy.
I apologize.
Welcome back.
Thank you, man.
You got an iPhone, right?
Don't do that. We don't have to do that here.
I'm asking a question, sir.
Yes, I do.
I understand why that happened, but go ahead.
We're not gonna do that here, but I will address that later in a team meeting. So okay. No, what I was saying, Jeniece, with you rubbing shoulders with the variety or everyone on the spectrum, do you feel like there has been progression, right, with your industry expertise in regards to executives willing to live, right, amongst their employees, right? I think that's very interesting, right? Mm-hmm. Are you willing to live amongst the people that you work with?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. So, you know, we have a term in fair housing and other spaces called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And, you know, since, you know, but there's also a term in fair housing in you know, folks that we talk about, WIMBYism and YIMBYism, yes in my backyard, or welcome in my backyard. And so again, that's one of those community education pieces around getting folks to see the longer term value of making neighborhoods inclusive when it comes to fair and affordable housing. So again, that's a grassroots organizing effort, that's community education, that takes strategy, that takes folks from all walks of life saying, you know, yes, you know, we want, you know, to make sure that our neighborhood is inclusive. We want to make sure that we want to reduce homelessness in our community. We want to slow the rate of eviction so that we attract additional businesses to our area so that they see, you know, this is a stable, these are stable communities with a stable workforce, and people aren't getting put out all over the place, and we got to worry about, you know, that. So I think that there's a business value to, you know, economic development value to stable, you know, communities, and folks looking when they're thinking of bringing their next, you know, opening their next big branch in Cincinnati, you know, looking at the data and saying, is this community stable? You know, or am I going to take a risk of, you know, housing instability? So we think if we can continue to successfully frame it that way, we'll have better results. We'll have consistently improved results.
So you're saying if we can continue to show that there has been success when people live amongst is that whomever, all different walks of life living amongst each other, if we can continue to prove that there's success within that, then we will have better results. Do you feel like people are ready from that, from your experience and from just having these type of conversations?
Yes, and there are neighborhoods that are successfully integrated to a point. You know,
which ones are there that you've seen?
We feel like so Lincoln Heights, Kennedy Heights, some of those areas. You know, some areas on the east side of town. You know,
Pleasant Ridge is one.
Westwood, Pleasant Ridge, Mount Healthy. You know, so yeah, you know, it's just, you know, when you look at development and affordability over time, you know, in terms of making sure that, you know, it's affordable for a large range of folks, and that it's intentional. You know, when you're thinking about new development, that affordability is a factor. I think that that's where, you know, we start to see the loss of affordable units. So the report that Community Building Institute did in 2017 identified about a 40,000 unit deficit in affordable units in Hamilton County. And so if you go to Community Building Institute, Xavier University, you can see that report. And again, you know, it identified, you know, clearly the need and clearly some ideas on how to do it in areas where it's been done.
Okay, I appreciate that. I know we're wrapping up pretty soon. I think one of the last things that I want to touch upon is I want to recap with, if someone is facing eviction, be sure to contact and stay in contact with your landowner or your rental agency or whomever. Email, keep the email threads, text threads, all of those things work, be in constant communication. But also, Jeniece, is there any other advice or guidance that you can give people in regards to avoiding being discriminated against, or not giving people a reason to even feel like they can discriminate against you?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, we don't think there's any rational reason, you know,
for discriminate, right?
There isn't.
Yeah, so we can, so that's why we, you know, so even when we investigate illegal discrimination cases, you know, we don't even look to rationale. We don't even necessarily look to motivation. We just
it's
say,
illegal. Because it's illegal.
Yeah, the data is such. But some things folks can do if they feel that they've been illegally discriminated is contact us. And around COVID-19 in particular, So COVID-19 may result in folks becoming disabled. And disability is a protected class. So everybody that gets COVID is not necessarily disabled, but they might be. And if they feel like they're being discriminated against necessarily because someone believes they had COVID, or, you know, they might have had, you know, or they have a major life activity or function that's being impacted, and they feel like they're being discriminated against, or there's a lot of questions, or they need some type of reasonable accommodation and they're being denied it, they should contact home. Unfortunately, another area that we see a lot of around discrimination whenever there's an economic downturn, which we can anticipate that there is around sex discrimination and sex harassment. So again, that's another circumstance where if you feel like you're being discriminated based on your sex or your gender identity, your gender expression, please contact home. And again, we're also concerned about folks of Asian descent because of the erroneous belief that somehow they caused COVID or they brought COVID here. You know, again, we also concerned about harassment related to housing for folks of Asian descent. And then the disparate impact on African Americans and Latinx communities is also a concern for us.
For sure.
In terms of policies or practices that housing providers may put in place that could disproportionately impact those communities.
Thank you.
I appreciate that. Thank you for that, Jeniece.
Wow, his video went off. But thank you so much. I really, you know, with this being recorded, and we're going to share this information on our website. I think this, you know, I personally know people who have lost their jobs, who are unsure about how they're going to pay their bills and how they're going to proceed amid this COVID-19. And you know, JeRod and myself have been thinking, you know, hey, we need to you know, bring you on, you know, bring Kevin on, bring other people on to talk about these kind of issues, because I'm hoping that, you know, with this information today, this might help someone. If it helps one person, that's amazing for me, you know.
Absolutely.
You know, so thank you so much. JeRod, you got any last thoughts?
I appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys. I appreciate keep doing what you're doing. This is a great platform. And again, you can, if you have any other additional questions, they can, you know, reach out to you. You can reach out to me, and we can, I can try to get additional information to folks if they need it.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. So next week, JeRod, let's talk about next week, JeRod, really quickly. I'm gonna let you. No, what are we doing next week? Let's talk about it.
Next week, we are going to be, we're going to be attacking some of these social justice issues that we still have been seeing with the Ahmaud Arbery case, the most recent case with your girl Breonna in Louisville, and even not even just with her death, but that her whomever was in the house with her, right? I think he was trying to protect his house. He shot a police officer. Very controversy. He was just recently released to house arrest. And there's been some controversy, right? Controversy in regards to him being released. The Fraternal Order of Police in Louisville put out a statement against the judge who released him. So I can't wait to attack these things, and we'll talk about them soon for sure.
Certainly. Thank you, JeRod. So Jeniece, thank you so much again.
Thank you, guys.
This is very, very, very valuable information. I did share the links. My great friend shared the links on our Facebook Live as well. Ashley, thank you again for that, Ashley. Here's your shout out. Definitely want to bring you on as well to talk about Darkness to Light. But thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch. We'll be in touch very, very soon, okay?
Have a good night.
Yes, ma'am. Enjoy, okay?
All right.
All right, bye-bye.
All right, have a good one.
All right, brother.